Hello, and welcome to the Wednesday, October 24th edition of the Cluster API subproject from SIG Cluster Lifecycle. We have a decent agenda today, so let's go ahead and get started. First up is action items from last week. There was a PR open for upstreaming provisioning scripts with no link in the agenda notes. Does anybody know which PR number that is offhand? Or want to talk to it?
The PR is still not open, but we will try to get it sorted out tomorrow.
Okay, so maybe the action item was to create a PR. Is that right? Okay, so that's assigned to Marco. I'm going to put your name in here so I know who to call on next time. Marco, I left some comments on the provisioning scripts doc last night. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at those, but it would be worth maybe taking another pass on talking about exactly what we want in the provisioning scripts that we upstream. I think we talked about the doc either last week or the week before. I guess it was last week looking at the notes. And I think I agree that the bootstrapping scripts are similar. I think we should also maybe think about the bootstrapping scripts in sort of two layers. There's one layer that is basically get the underlying operating system sort of up to snuff, like make sure we've got the container runtime installed, make sure we have the kubelet installed, kubeadium installed, et cetera. And the other sort of part of the provisioning scripts is the actual cluster formation part, which for a lot of providers right now is kubeadium init, kubeadium join. But I also don't necessarily want to lock people into thinking that that's the only way to create clusters. Kubeadium is a really useful building block, but it's not the only building block that we can use, right? And I mentioned in the doc, people like COPS are going to want to start adopting the Cluster API, but haven't adopted kubeadium. And if those are sort of the official ways and the only ways that we test, that might make it harder for other projects to come into the fold. But it might be nice if COPS was willing to help us standardize on the parts of the scripts that actually get the operating system sort of ready to be turned into a machine.
Sounds good. I will take a look at the comments and see is there anything outstanding now. And if not, when it is ready, I will create a PR and then we can move discussion there.
Thank you. That's awesome. All right, Jason, you're up next. This was your agenda item from last week that we didn't quite get to, so we stuck it at the top for today.
So I think that one was actually the other Jason.
Oh, was it?
Jason Murray, I believe, yes.
Oh, I didn't realize there were so many Jasons. Is that Jason not here today? Let's see. I don't see him in the call. All right, I'm going to bump it down, and if he shows up before the end, we'll go ahead and cover this. And we'll get to this Jason's topic, which is about phases.
Yeah, so as we're building out the AWS provider and we started demoing it to people, we found that there's a lot of confusion when you start talking about Cluster API and using clusterctl as a kind of entry point for it, because there are a lot of concepts that are kind of interleaved just during the bootstrapping process. You're having to explain, the process of the bootstrap cluster and why many cubes involved in some cases. And you're also having to describe pivoting the cluster and then also the actual Cluster API components. So one of the things we'd like to do to kind of ease people into the introduction of Cluster API was to see if we could break clusterctl into separate, distinct phases similar to the kubeadium phases, so that we can actually walk people through the steps and talk through it at that level as well. And it seems like there are some other folks that are interested in being able to just run a subset of the steps that we do in clusterctl as well. So the issue that's linked in there, I tried to do a quick breakdown of a way that I think we could kind of introduce phases support without being too disruptive with a super large PR trying to introduce it with one big, thunk. So yeah, please take a look.
Well, I don't see Jan in the call today, but he mentioned he had a slightly different workflow on your PR a couple hours ago, or on your issue a couple hours ago, where instead of, like, he basically just says he bypasses having a bootstrap cluster at all and basically creates a cluster in the same way that we are currently creating the bootstrap cluster, right? So currently we create the bootstrap cluster by default's a Minikube, where we stick the API, the cluster API stack onto that Minikube VM. And he's saying that he just creates a master directly and sticks the cluster API stack onto that master. So I think we have to be a little bit careful in terms of forcing people into a particular workflow. I know that Block and some of the other folks from VMware have also been interested in experimenting with different ways to do the bootstrapping flow. So I'm a little concerned about sort of codifying what we have now before we allow sort of the different alternatives to be explored, because there might be a significantly better way than what we're doing now. And especially if people don't expect this command line interface to be somewhat consistent over time, or we start writing configuration files people expect to have compatibility, that might tie our hands a little bit if we find a better way to do it.
The trick that Kops did here is we have feature flags. The idea being that you export an environment variable to turn on the feature flag, or something like that, and then we basically don't offer guarantees if a feature flag is on. So it lets us do this sort of stuff without committing to it, and it's sort of like it's a pretty clear, like, I am stepping outside the bounds, but it still lets you get all, it would seem to me, most of the benefits in terms of the exposition, being able to run each step one at a time.
Another option too is what kubeadm did for a very long time was just to say it's alpha phases, and there's no guarantees underneath anything that's explicitly declared as alpha. As in the flag was literally alpha-phases? kubeadm alpha phases, and then you could execute each individual phase. That's also very clear, yeah.
Yeah, I think taking either of those approaches would satisfy my concerns, right? My concern is mainly I don't want to get locked into what we think of the current set of phases if we find a better set of phases in the future. I think breaking things down into smaller bite-sized chunks makes a lot of sense. The code already is sort of starting getting partitioned that way, and the people that we're talking about wanting to change different parts are basically trying to change the implementation of specific phases, I think as outlined in Jason's issue. Right, maybe we do pivoting, maybe we don't do pivoting, maybe we have a bootstrap cluster here, maybe we don't. And so being able to selectively apply those phases and swap in your own bits for other ones makes a lot of sense.
Yep. So I think I'll definitely probably go for the alpha approach. I think the feature flags may be a little bit more difficult to implement at this state. So I'll go ahead and I'll update the outstanding PR that I have now to implement it as clearly alpha. And then we can always adjust granularity and kind of individual steps as we need to.
So next I put on the agenda, and I mentioned this during the SIG cluster lifecycle meeting yesterday as well, but there is a SIG sponsored, if you will, deep dive on the cluster API at KubeCon. I'm currently signed up as the only presenter, but I think it would make a lot of sense to have two presenters, and in particular somebody not from Google, so that we have a little bit of company diversity representing our SIG during the talk. And so I wanted to put a call out to folks that if you are interested in being a co-presenter and you haven't reached out to me yet, please do so. I'll collect folks by the end of the week and then try to come up with some sort of fair and equitable process for selecting a co-presenter. There's been more than one person who's reached out so far, so clearly not everybody's going to get it. And we'll try to figure out a way that people feel happy with the process. And it's less relevant to this group of people, but the same thing is happening on the kubeadm side. Our SIG has a deep dive in Seattle KubeCon for kubeadm, and Tim is also looking for a co-presenter for that in a similar vein. So that's sort of your final reminder, and the people that have reached out will decide offline and let folks know what the resolution is for that. All right, next is Dan, renaming ProviderConfig to ProviderSpec.
Yeah, so this is, we discussed this, I think, maybe a couple of months ago, and then there was the sort of CRD change, so I was waiting for that to land. So this is to change ProviderConfig to ProviderSpec, just to be more consistent with the typical spec status convention that Kubernetes APIs use. And there is a PR on cluster API, but I'm still, I wanted to run an experiment with at least one provider. So just going to use the GCP provider to make sure that I could actually apply those changes on the provider and make sure that everything was working. But there was a request on the PR that if we change this to ProviderSpec, that we bump the version from V1 Alpha 1 to V1 Alpha 2. And the corollary of that is that because we're on CRDs now, we would have to drop the V1 Alpha 1 because we can only serve one API at a time. So just wanted to get feedback. This is not a critical PR by any means. It's just, I think it's a nice to have. So I'm happy to, yeah, just want to get the feedback, and there's no hurry to land this, but it would be nice to have, I think.
Yeah, I'm the person who did this request, and I actually have a question first. So it's only possible to have one version right now? I thought by now CRD support multiple versions. Am I wrong there?
They do from, I think, 1.10. No, 1.9 actually. But the problem, I'm not sure about the renaming of fields. I think that there was some very simple idea how to do this, but unfortunately, I'm not sure that you can actually rename fields and you can actually get conversions.
Yeah, my understanding is you can have multiple versions as long as they're all the same.
Yeah, I think the multiple version support with conversion is supposed to be coming in 1.13, so it's not in a released version of Kubernetes yet.
Okay, yeah, I know that there are no conversions. The question was more around if you can have two versions at the same time being shown, even if they are completely different, probably.
You can. There is a versions field that was added, which was kind of a breaking change, but it's not a problem. But one of those versions that you specify is a storage version. So this one is actually saved in etcd.
Yeah, and so the two, so Alpha 1 and Alpha 2 would have to be the same today, and the recommended workaround is we would add provider spec to Alpha 1, I guess, and Alpha 2. Alpha 2 would have to add provider config, and we have both fields in both today, which I believe is the workaround.
How is that any different from just adding both fields to Alpha 1 and not adding Alpha 2?
Great intentions.
If you have to add both fields in both places, you're not actually doing anything useful.
I don't. I think it's aspirational.
Okay, so well, the background to the request in the first place was to make migration easier, but if we end up we can't have two distinct CRDs, that's obviously not the case. So yeah, in that case, I'll just take back the request and let's keep it at V1 Alpha 1, unless someone else has a reason.
Is waiting for 1.13 also an option?
I think our APIs are alpha, and they're likely to keep changing in subtly breaking ways, and probably explicitly breaking ways for a little bit longer as we stabilize. So I don't think there's a lot of value to waiting. I think we should get it in and try to start fixing the things we know need to be fixed now.
Okay, then yeah, I will go and make sure that that the change will work with at least one provider, and then I'll update the PR with those results.
Great. Yeah, thanks for bringing it to the meeting. I think we got this resolved a lot faster this way than going back and forth on the PR. It looked like that conversation was going to take a long time to resolve offline. All right, David, you're next with the GitBook. And I may have to do something special in Zoom to allow you to present. I assume you want to present. See. Did that do it? Yeah, excellent.
Can you see this?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so I started writing this up yesterday. I've really not spent a lot of time, but I wanted to get some feedback now because there's a lot of confusion about exactly what the rules of the cluster AP are, what the semantics are for the different controllers, and what the controllers expect of the actuators. So I can go through and show some of the, and I've stolen a lot of this text from the original KEP, from the kubebuilder documentation itself, as well as David's open PR on this subject. I was interested to find, reading some of this text, how it's no longer accurate. And in fact, things are simpler now, thank goodness. So I didn't want to go through the whole thing because a lot of it's incomplete, but I had some primary questions that I wanted to get feedback on to see if they were acceptable to the group. So one of the first things is, do we like the idea of using GitBook? I personally think it's a great choice because it allows us to write in Markdown, but still allows us to have pretty formatting, search, and other things like that. Is everybody familiar with GitBook?
I'm only familiar in the sense that I've seen the kubebuilder documentation, but I don't know a lot about how you create it, how you publish it, et cetera. If you give a little background on that, that'd be really awesome.
So the gist of it is there's 1 or 2 JSON files, but everything else is Markdown. The Markdown references other Markdown files, so there's a certain expected structure. And then there's a command, gitbook build, which will then render HTML, which you then check into the repository. And then you can serve through like get pages, or I think kubebuilder uses something called Firebase. So however you want to serve that HTML. There's also a number of plugins available. It looks to be fairly well supported. Yeah, that's the high level view. The alternative that I've used in the past is something like Sphinx, which people don't like restructured text for various reasons. So.
Okay, so the gitbook build command, is that just a binary download and run locally on your system then?
Yeah, you install it with npm. Okay, so.
Neat. Okay.
SIG contributors were planning at some point to use this for like writing documentation for contributors, and everybody being able to contribute to the book. And if you want feedback on how this went, we should go to SIG contributors and ask them. Like I'm sure that Paris Pittman and Aaron Krickenberger have knowledge of this. I think this is a good solution and definitely something we should consider.
Another thing I don't know if I made this clear enough, but this is what kubebuilder does as well. And that's how I learned of it. I thought their book was very well written. So copy people better than you.
Yeah, no, I also enjoyed the kubebuilder documentation. I think this looks great. I just wanted to know a little bit more about how it works if we're going to be creating the book as opposed to just consuming the book. So thank you.
Right. Yeah, it's actually very straightforward. I learned how to do it in about 15 minutes. So, okay, so the next big question before I get into the more technical parts, we have to decide on an audience. And when you look at the kubebuilder book, they target just about every audience possible. I would kind of like to do that too, but there's some stumbling blocks. So if you see the audiences that I've started out with, I talk about Kubernetes users, so people that just want to deploy a Kubernetes cluster quickly so that they can deploy applications. I talk about infrastructure engineers who may want to be able to deploy multiple Kubernetes clusters to build hybrid cloud environments. These are different. These users have very, very different skill sets, right? And then finally, there's Kubernetes developers who have the need to implement providers. And I feel like that's where we have the most pressing need for documentation at this time. So I guess just I'll put the question out there. Assuming that we could document all of these things, do we think it's appropriate to have one book do so?
Presumably with GitBook, we could create different books for the different users, or we could create one book that sort of addresses all audiences, right?
Right. So the biggest problem I have when I try to document the Kubernetes user experience is that that's when you have to delve into the provider-specific implementation details. And currently, we don't have enough uniformity around the use of cluster control to make that easy. If everyone used cluster control and it worked really well, we would just document cluster control and say, just use that. But that's not the case right now. So for the foreseeable future, I imagine we would have to pick a single implementation and document that, and then point to the other provider-specific documentation for any nuances or variations thereof.
Is it the case that we expect clusterctl to evolve into such a tool, or should we? Is my bias understanding, whatever, was that clusterctl was more of a sort of proof of concept, and there would be more polished tools like GKE or COPS or other things that I'm sure will, or KubeCoin, right? That I'm sure will evolve that use the cluster API, and that the user documentation should be about, you know, what are machine deployments and how does that translate, and that not necessarily focusing on like how does the cluster first get bootstrapped, but more like what is the experience of managing machine infrastructures, stream infrastructure through the Kubernetes API, which should be cross everything.
I think that's a fair point. I think that so when you think of a quick start documentation, I think it's a little much to ask people to think about what it means to delete a machine versus increase the number of replicas in a machine set, right? Really what they need to know is in like 5 lines or less, how do I get a kubeconfig so I can start using the cluster? And that's where I think having common tooling around cluster deployment is extremely important. I'm not convinced cluster control is that tooling. Well, I really do not believe it is now. And I'm not sure that it will be in the future. It could be that we have something better. But I do believe that having uniformity of deployment means is part of the value of cluster API. I think it's some of the essential value, really. So it could be that cluster control is just not at a point right now where it makes sense to document in sufficient depth for people to start out using it.
Yeah, it's one thing I was going to say is maybe this first audience is aspirational rather than tactical. And we say it might make sense in the future if clusterctl evolves to the point where we are trying to explain to end users how to use it directly. But at this point, we're sort of maybe more targeting the second 2 audiences, which is, certainly developers of people that are creating the provider configs. And then also, maybe people that are more about cluster management than just straight cluster users, right? And even some of those people might use something like COPS or GKE or other sort of more mature products. And we'd hope to sort of get the cluster API up to the maturity level where even if they're using COPS, they would still like get bounced from the COPS documentation back into some of this documentation as they manage machines, right? So we'd want to sort of think about helping people understand the use cases that the cluster APIs, the machine APIs are solving, even if they kind of like jump into the middle of the book coming from another system that has adopted the API.
I think that makes sense. And if you read the KubeBuilder documentation, they actually have a section of sort of aspirational goals. things that they haven't done that may happen later.
Right, and I think, as Justin pointed out, and as you said, like I don't think we've decided as a group yet whether we have the aspirational goal to make clusterctl be that deployer tool. Right, I mean, I think that is one possible future where we could say, we could make it good enough to be that deployer tool, but it's not clear if we want to at this point, right? Or whether it's good enough to be a tool that we can use for iterating on the cluster API itself and running, testing of the cluster API, whereas we'd have other tools that we expect end users to interact with directly.
I agree.
We have other tools that actually execute the cluster API though to run through the lifecycle operations right now. I mean, we have kubectl and clusterctl, but neither of those are actually very well documented on how to use those against cluster API. So I think for somebody coming in new to the project, they see the API, they see the objects, but they don't know how to use it. If we don't document clusterctl, we should at least document how to use it with kubectl to start out with. We need something.
So that's actually what we did internally. We wanted to use cluster control. It didn't work out, and we used kube control instead. So I like that idea a lot.
Yeah, and I'm not saying we shouldn't document clusterctl. We should document enough that people that are trying to develop for the cluster API can certainly use it. I just don't know that we need sort of polished end user documentation where we expect somebody who's not sort of a Kubernetes developer or not, either familiar or trying to become familiar with the cluster API repository, if we're really targeting that audience at this point, or whether that audience is, aspirational down the road or out of scope entirely, right? That's the other option. So I do like the different audiences here. And I think leaving that first audience there makes a lot of sense because we are going to start to get pieces of documentation that do apply to end users, at least indirectly, even if they're not using clusterctl for deployment. And then I think maybe, as you said, we have a big gap on the Kubernetes developers section right now. And there's also the existing PR trying to fill some of that in Markdown directly in the repo, where we do want to have better documentation for ourselves.
Right. So I've started combining the documentation that I read from the 2 PRs I've seen open, as well as again going through the KEP and some other notes. I don't think this is actually, this right now is very high level in terms of describing what the objects are, what the purpose of the objects are, but I don't think they give you quite the detail necessary to build your own provider. So to give you an example, I go through and I quote the code, and then I have some documentation about the purpose of the object. And then you'll have something like this to do here. This to do is actually fairly critical if you want to use cluster control to deploy. There's about 2 or 3 gotchas like this that I feel like I would really rather not explain to people why they need to be done. Not because I don't think it's interesting, but because I think there's a long history of tickets and it would take a while. Let me tangent on that point just briefly. So this is a slightly condensed version of what I believe the machine actuator, what the expectation of the machine actuator is, or the machine controller. I think that this documentation is essential for someone implementing a provider. And it's concise. I think, I mean, maybe the language isn't perfect, but I mean, I wrote it very less, and hopefully others can help improve it. The bigger concern is things like this to do, and there's more to do's, but things like this to do. So later on in the agenda, there was a question about whether or not the skeleton repository I created should be moved under kubernetes-sigs. This has come up a number of times. I'm convinced we should not do that. I think that we can build something much simpler just using kubebuilder, and then add just the couple of to-dos like the status annotation, the single cluster per namespace requirement, a few of those known gotchas. If those were added to just a basic kubebuilder definition, I think we could have something that would be shorter than the skeleton repository and more easily documented. So that's where we get into this provider implementations overview bootstrapping. My hope was if we agree that we would like to have some sort of scaffolding for new provider implementers, I would like to kill the skeleton repository and replace it with a fresh kubebuilder start.
I think, I mean, to jump ahead on the agenda, I think that's what Jason was proposing, which with basically updating the provider skeleton to use CRDs, was basically to update it to be fresh based on a kubebuilder start, which I think would also greatly simplify it. I'm curious, when you say to not use that and to just put documentation here, do you think it would be sufficient for bootstrapping documentation here to say, run, create a repo, run these 3 commands, modify these 3 files, and now you're up and running? Or is there more sort of scaffolding templating that we need to provide to people, in which case having a repo to copy would give us a place to put the other parts?
So I think there's a trade-off. I think that the kubebuilder instructions, if we explain just how to use kubebuilder to create your ProviderSpec, et cetera, that could be described succinctly. And it's a manual process, but it makes it very clear what you're doing. I think you leave the process with a better understanding of why you did what you did. The problem with that is that it doesn't deal with these to-dos like the status annotation. And so we have a choice there. We either have to explain the status annotation, make it go away, or follow the skeleton repo model, whereby we build the whole thing, we can document how we built it, but then the intended use is that we duplicate the repository instead of recreating it. And I'm not sure which is better. I think that's an open question in my mind.
So I think you should go with the option where you document like the gotchas about the status annotation and stuff like that. And probably remove the skeleton repository. I think that's the right thing to do.
Okay.
I guess there are 2 things I'll say. Is one, I think that the steps are greatly simplified now that we're using the kubebuilder and CRDs. Like before, trying to explain in prose what you needed to do to bootstrap a provider repo was really difficult, which is why you created the skeleton in the first place. I think it's a lot simpler now. And 2, I think that the rate at which new providers are being created has also declined significantly since you created the skeleton repo. I think we saw it used a number of times very rapidly, but the rate of people, I think, looking to fork it and create new ones has also decreased significantly. So I don't know that the effort of keeping it up to date is particularly useful for us at this point.
I think that's a good point. Okay, so that's primarily what I had. I could go over more of this, what I've written so far and copied from others. But I think the big question is if I PR'd, so part of the reason for doing this is that we have a lot of people that are interested in writing documentation. And I think this would give us a good framework for others to begin contributing. There are certain areas in particular around machine sets and machine deployments where I think Hardik and others probably should write those sections. They seem to know the most about it, right? Yeah, so I guess the question is, if I polish this up and put up a PR, do we think this is something that we would like to, as a group, work on? And I guess, I don't know if that's a lazy consensus vote, like I put up a PR and we just find out, but.
Yeah,
I would vote yes.
I think maybe a different way to phrase what you're asking is it worth your effort to get that PR ready?
Right.
Because it's going to take some time to get ready. And if then you find out that people don't want it, it's been a waste of your time. So floating it here as like looking for like, does anyone think this is a bad idea? Is there a different way people would suggest doing it? And so far in chat, I'm seeing lots and lots of +1s and no alternate suggestions. So I think moving on to sending the PR and makes a lot of sense at this point.
Okay. Excellent. That's all I had.
One corollary to that, there is the open issue that does add some markdown documentation to the repo, the open PR, which I was reviewing yesterday and was about ready to merge. Should we hold off on that and basically just fold that documentation into your GitBook, or should we merge that now so something exists prior to the GitBook PR coming in?
I don't object to merging it, but I will say that I think that I've already copied the most important parts. So, I mean, my hope would be, no matter what the state of this, by the next meeting, I would like to have a PR up, and hopefully even sooner, so that we can, you know, next week, I'd like others to be able to start contributing. And, yeah.
So David, I'm not very familiar with the GitBook. The contributions, the PRs themselves against the book are going to be in Markdown. Is that correct?
Yes.
And where should the book live? Should it be in the cluster API repository?
So that's where I've been developing it now. I think that's the right place for it. So I have under the docs directory a GitBook directory where all of this is based. I think the big question, well, independent of if it lives there or in a different repo, I think it should live with the repo, at least so that the code's there, the links make more sense. But the big question would be, where is it hosted, right? Because a lot of the value of this, I think, comes from the fact that you can write the markdown, but you can view the HTML.
Can we use GitHub websites for this?
I think so. So I think it would be a GitHub Pages thing.
Yeah, I think this is going to be optimal.
Has anyone had experience setting up GitHub Pages? I know that the Kubernetes docs used to use GitHub Pages and they moved away from them. They didn't use GitBook, though, to generate the HTML for those pages.
I think it's a SaaS service, GitBook itself. So maybe Philip knows how to set that up as it's done for KubeBuilder.
Yeah, so to use GitHub Pages, I'd assume you'd have to actually like write HTML to a branch and push it, because GitHub Pages out of the box only supports Jekyll, right? And yeah, so it can do like a very basic Jekyll build. If you want anything custom or anything other than Jekyll, you have to like commit the output HTML into a branch and push that.
So is there going to be a blocker in terms of like the GitBook in this case? Do we, like looking in the future, do you think that eventually the GitHub Pages are going to be blocking us because of functionality, like they blocked the Kubernetes website?
I don't think so. I mean, we could probably use like the new GitHub Actions thing in the future to extend anything. I don't know. I mean, it's probably better to ask what KubeBuilder uses at the moment, right? And maybe there is some shared info or whatever. Yeah, because the only way I used GitHub Pages was for really basic Jekyll stuff. Like in the clusterctl, just to give you an example, we have a thing where we basically just render README in a pre-tier format.
Yeah, I think this is going to work. Maybe the HTML hosting can be migrated eventually. if there's a problem, I guess.
Yeah, I wouldn't see this as a problem.
Nandir mentions in chat that gitbook.com is the SaaS that KubeBuilder is using for their hosting. So I can ask Phil if we can maybe piggyback on their account. I don't know how they're paying for that.
Sounds about right.
That would be nice. Oh, or Jason says maybe it's just free for us since we're open source, which would be even better. And we can create our own account. Okay, so I think maybe David, if you could take that as an action to look a little bit more into the hosting. I think we definitely want to get the PR started to get this in, and we also want to get the HTML viewable as well.
I have one additional question around the GitBook here, more specific just to the documentation. Do we also intend to add, let's say, a provider-specific sections in this, like, you know, for all the known providers that have implemented clustered API, maybe a smaller section for them explaining like the provider-specific things in the same documentation here? Is that also a goal or something that we want to do?
So for kubeadm as an example here, we decided to not include any cloud provider specific bits into the kubeadm documentation. And the long-term plan is to delegate documentation work to the cloud providers themselves using like, hey, this is a link for AWS. And I think in this case, it should be similar. You could have a landing page explaining like the overview of this cloud provider, but the specific, to my understanding, can be pretty huge for a certain cloud provider. And ideally, you're not going to want this in the book.
So Lubomir, to clarify, are you suggesting having something in this GitBook that says like, here are some supported places where you can run this, and then you can like click, like it'll say AWS, GCP, DigitalOcean, et cetera, and you click on the AWS one and it would take you to a different place that describes in detail how you'd configure the provider specific parts for AWS and not include those in line. I think that's what you're suggesting. I just want to clarify.
Yeah, that's my suggestion pretty much. And you leave it to the provider to document the specifics, and you have a landing page for the provider and a quick overview, but the specific, the provider themselves.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
But would that mean that the providers, for example, will be responsible for hosting their own documentation somewhere that they put a link here? I mean, is that, I mean, I guess that's what is kind of leaning to.
Well, you can have, you can basically link to a README somewhere in the cloud provider specific repo. Because
for VMware, we're fine with this. We use GitBook for the previous open source project I worked on outside of Kubernetes, and we VMware pages.
Yeah, I guess I could imagine what Lubomir was saying is like you could link to a README in, say the cluster API provider GCP repo, or if that repo decided they wanted to have a GitBook to make their documentation look nicer, you could link into their GitBook as well, right?
Yeah, we can connect GitBooks eventually, but as a start, we can basically link to a README in a GitHub repo.
Yeah, I like that model. It's also in line with what we have today, where the main repo has links out to the different known provider implementations, but doesn't describe them in detail, right? The other thing I'll point out is in some ways this is similar to like the actuator interfaces, where we're gonna sort of need to maybe have a somewhat standardized way to say for the providers to present the information that gets linked to, right? We want it to be a somewhat consistent experience where if you say, I want to see how we do this on AWS, it says, here are the provider-specific fields. I want to see on GCP, here are the provider-specific fields, instead of saying, if I go to AWS, now it dumps me into something very different from what I would see on the other one. So it would be nice if we could maintain at least some consistency there for the provider-specific bits. But that might also be hard to keep in sync in the long term.
Yeah, I guess for the common ground between the providers, this is great to have something that is shared between the providers. But if you have something that is completely unique to a certain provider, it shouldn't be in the main repo. The book, I mean, and also not having provider-specific PRs in the book is going to reduce the noise, whatever the book is hosted as a repository.
All right, great. Thanks.
So the next thing on the agenda, we had sort of punted, which was about the provider skeleton, but we did touch on that quite a bit during this conversation. So I filled some notes in there, and I think we will mark that as done. Let's see. Next, so we're running a little bit low on time, so we'll try to go quickly here. Next, there's a question about defaulting with webhooks and using pointers. I linked some folks into this conversation that should know what's going on with CRDs. I haven't caught up. It looks like it hasn't been commented on for a couple days, so I haven't caught up. I guess, Alvaro, what are you hoping that we can switch to pointers here to solve the immediate problem, or are we looking to?
Yes, basically yes, because that would solve the problem. Just to quickly summarize, right now it's not possible if you have a struct field that is not a pointer but a literal inside some type, you cannot default it by a webhook. And that got also confirmed by some other folks. Yeah, and I think the best solution would be to simply make it a pointer. It's optional already, so yeah, unless people have concerns with that.
One thing about there was like a comment about deployments and strategy that there is that is a little struck there. And I actually talked with one of the developers in the KubeCon about this thing exactly, and they mentioned that they wanted to change it. However, it will break every single controller that's using the formats out there. So they pretty much didn't like to do it, so they're stuck with it. So we can try to avoid this thing. It would be great. I mean, even if you look at the API conventions documentation that I pasted in the meeting minutes, it's pretty much stated that it's much easier to and very recommended to have pointers instead of structs.
Okay. So what you're saying, Martin, is we should use pointers because that's what they would use if they could, but they can't use pointers because it would break compatibility.
I mean, it won't break compatibility for as the end API, but it will break compatibility for like every single Go developer out there. So yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Okay. Yeah, I think then switching to pointers makes sense for those aforementioned reasons. Well, I think we should follow sort of the same process where we put a hold on the PR and give folks a couple of days to object if they have strong objections. And then we'll go ahead and merge it at the end of this week if people don't object. Next is cluster API CRD with namespace. Hui, let's see, are you on the call?
Yes.
Yes. Right.
Yes, I'm working on this CI for cluster API vSphere for end-to-end test, and we separate the bootstrap cluster with our controller, machine controller, and deployment. So we want to share the same bootstrap cluster, and I'm wondering whether we can just deploy multiple instance machine controllers to the same bootstrap cluster, and that will work. I know in theory, CRD do support namespace, but I'm wondering whether anyone already doing that, and that's what would be great.
To answer your question, I know a lot of people have talked about wanting to do that. I don't know if it works yet. There were some open issues about making sure that machines and clusters in the same namespace were correctly linked together. That was certainly a use case that people wanted to support. I haven't actually tried it myself. Has anyone else on the call tried this to see if it works?
If not, I'm just going to try it out and to see, maybe I'll report it back next week.
Okay. Yeah, you can also maybe ask in Slack because someone might respond there if they've tried this and connect with them too.
I don't think this works for the same reason you can't have multiple API registration resources, right? The CRDs aren't namespaced.
I thought that the custom resource definition was not namespaced, but when you created an instance of that custom resource, it could be within a namespace. Is that not true?
That is
no,
true.
that is true.
So you create a CRD that says this is how I define a cluster, and you say I want a cluster namespace A, I want a cluster namespace B. And would that be enough to use the same bootstrap cluster to instantiate 2 clusters from there?
Yes, I think that works.
Okay. I think the answer, Hui, is it may work. You should go try it and let us know. Because I think it's something we want to be able to support.
All right, thanks.
Cool, thank you. Lock, glog, how much do we like it? And Justin has a link to another.
Oh yeah. So I found I don't know what the version of glog was that you guys originally wrote for C++, but that's the one I'm more used to. But I find this one pretty little lackluster. We developed a logging package for our last open source project here at VMware that allow you to do tracing through your code. So it has operational tracing, so you could actually trace an operation from end to end, from one component to the next component, etc. And you can also log to remote syslog server. And you know, I kind of miss it. Part of the reason why I'm asking this is because I miss that ability. Not so yeah, that's my question. I noticed that a lot of Kubernetes project uses glog, so I know that this might be the answer might be we're stuck with glog. I'm not sure.
I can comment. I think we're not stuck with glog. I think lots of people want to fix a bunch of things. I think different people want to fix it to different degrees. I personally want to do something which sounds more like what you're talking about, I think, which is I want to have logging integrated with tracing in the sort of open tracing type world. So that sort of tracing like spans. It sounds like that's something similar to what you built with what you built in your previous project. I don't know what the right way is to move forwards on this. I feel like one approach would be that we prototype it in a smaller project like Cluster API. Another one would be that we take it to SIG architecture and try to get their input. I don't think that would be very productive in that without something to look at, it's difficult to form an informed opinion.
So our logging package is open source. It's not in a separate repo, but we can separate it out into a separate repo that makes it easier to look at. I'm not very familiar with open tracing.
Yeah, there's a bunch of, yeah, I mean, I'd love to look at it. If you want to put a link in the notes, I'll certainly take a look at it. I think we want to avoid requiring a tracing package, but I think it would be great to integrate with a tracing package personally. Okay. But it is politically fraught because there are lots of people who have businesses built around like, you should use our tracing package. And so open tracing is a generic API. There is still like conflicts over which API to use. So we might need our own API on top, but it's certainly, I don't think anyone loves glog. I just think it's the one that we have the lowest common denominator. So
our logging package is not tied to our logging product at all. Our logging product can parse the logs and then match everything up, but our logging package is just plain Go. Okay, so let me put together something and then I'll paste it, and maybe I'll show it to you guys next week or something.
Locke, hi.
Yeah.
This is Dems. So I'm running a few experiments on removing glog from the main KK repository. And there are several things that are going on there, which makes it hard because we depend on C advisor, and C advisor uses glog, and so there is recursive dependencies, so it's harder to extract the glog package out. But I would definitely say that if you have a separate repository with just the basic minimum that you need for logging, that would be a good start that we can prototype either in the cluster API repository or in the KK repository, whichever you feel comfortable.
And maybe, and I think we would be fine with merging some of the ideas that we have from our logging package to whatever logging package that we agree on. We just want the functionality.
Right. So at this point, I have at least one PR. There is one repository from Tim Hawken, which prototypes an interface for a logging package, how it could be work like. So, and if you have yours, the minimum that is required to do, that'll be a good thing to have when we debate this over at SIG architecture or somewhere else.
Okay.
But that doesn't stop Cluster API from adopting that logging package as long as the licensing is good.
It's Apache too.
Yeah. Okay, sounds good.
James, do we have an agenda item for SIG architecture?
Not yet, Justin. I'm waiting for Tim to take a look at what I have, and then we'll go to the next step. At this point, it's you, me, Tim Allclair, are at least the people who really want this going to unlock a bunch of people.
I was going to ask quickly, Tim, what the proposed replacement for glog is. Are we just going to use the built-in Go logging for now, or are we going to make it like an interface that's swappable? Or
all of them are on the table at this point. But at this point, what I'm trying to do is we have to fork glog as the first step, because we are not able to. You remember in the Golang log package, there is a set output method where you can redirect to any other logging. So we need something similar in glog first. So we have to fork glog first. And that was the point I was trying to make to Tim, and hopefully that got through yesterday. But he has to look at the PR, and then if he's okay with that, then our options are open up. We can use the repository that he started off with an interface for logging. That is one option. And if lock the stuff from VMware comes through, that will be a good thing too.
Okay, so how should I proceed to?
Yes. So lock. The first thing you should do is if you can separate out the code into a separate repository, and throw us a URL here in the Cluster API Slack, or just DM it to me. I will take a look, and then I will try to see where we can go from there.
Okay.
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 But once you have a separate repository, you can also propose a PR straight to Cluster API, and we can debate about that adoption of that in this repository as well.
Okay.
Okay.
So do you want to end, Robert?
Sorry, do I want what?
Do you want to end? I had a final comment about Robert.
Oh, I was just say we're a few minutes over time, so I want to be sensitive to people if they need to drop. There was one more thing on the agenda, and I wanted to check with Siddharth if it's okay to punt that till next week. And then if people want to sort of finish off this conversation, I have a couple minutes before I have to run and kill the recording. But I do want to make sure people realize that the meeting time is over, and it's and people can take off if they're ready to.
Yeah, we should probably end it right now. I mean, this is a very difficult discussion anyway. All right.
Yeah, it's probably worth just having Dims and Justin and folks that are interested in logging the chat offline at this point. So Siddharth, are you okay punting your agenda item till next week?
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
Okay, great. Thank you for being flexible. And with that, we'll wrap it up a few minutes late. Thank you for the full agenda and great conversation, and we'll see you guys again soon.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, bye.